Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unit 3. We're going to talk today about the French and Indian War. And you can see on our screen that we have really three different titles here. And part of the reason we do is because the French and Indian War, that name is the perspective from the colonists. They saw themselves with the British fighting the French and the Indians. But that's a bit of a misnomer because there were native peoples on both sides of the conflict. But it's the one in which we refer to this period in American history. Across the pond, people would have referred to it and still do as the 7 Years' War because it was part of a much larger conflict between many nations, including France, the Austrian Empire, and certainly Great Britain. But I do want you to think about this whole conflict and its result as really being the Great War for Empire. So about 100 years ago, people referred to World War I as the Great War because they could never imagine a global conflict of that scale ever again. Certainly, there were other great wars to come, but when we look at the French and Indian War, it was a global conflict, and it was a conflict that ultimately presented Great Britain with the empire they always thought they wanted in colonial North America. So we're going to look at that a little more closely today. And just so you can get a good look at our map here, the British colonies were a relatively small portion of North America in 1753. New France was considerably larger, and certainly New Spain as well. So basically, we're going to be looking at how much of this New France and how much of this New Spain will find itself in British hands by the time we get to 1763. But in 1700, you would have expected France to be the most powerful nation in the New World, considering how much land it controlled, when in actual fact, very few French people ever lived here. They controlled the interior waterways, starting from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi. We don't have it on this map, but also the Ohio River. And this is really what contributed to the success of New France and its claims of land, although not many people occupied it. So a little backstory. So about 60 years before the French and Indian War, there began to be a series of conflicts. The first ones with France, later ones with Spain, that were all an attempt of the British to gain more control of North America. So there's about a 25-year period of time known as King William's and Queen Anne's Wars. King William was the former Duke of Orange, who became the king after James II. The Queen Anne, who follows, is his daughter. And over the course of about 25 years, there continued to be fighting, particularly between France and Great Britain, for control of the northern parts of North America. And by 1713, with something called the Treaty of Utrecht, Canada, the northern part, which the British called Hudson Bay, becomes theirs. They also take control of Nova Scotia, which the French called Acadia, and also that land that's further to the east there, Newfoundland. And those people who lived there, they were French, but under British control for about 40 years. But on the eve of the French and Indian War, the British decided that they needed to move these Acadians out, and they put them to the next place that had a large French settlement to the south, far away, in Louisiana. So if you've ever heard the word Cajun, that's where it comes from. They were Acadians who were moved to that Louisiana area. But by 1713, the British had control of the Atlantic waters along the east coast of North America. And they had so much control and so little problem, particularly with the French, that we begin the period of time known as salutary neglect, which literally just means the time in which the British were not so concerned about enforcing the Navigation Acts and the taxes that came along with it. Now, by 1763, when the British need the money and they need to make sure that the taxes go back into effect and pass new taxes, that's what creates so many of the problems with the British colonists. If you could imagine going 50 years without anyone in your family really paying taxes and all of a sudden having to, you might feel that the government had a little too much authority. And we'll get to that in a later lesson. But you can see our map here, Hudson Bay, this northern portion of what we call Canada today, plus Newfoundland, plus Nova Scotia, and the English colonies. The British Empire and colonial America is certainly growing by 1713. We will also see conflicts between the British and the Spanish. And again, many of those will be confined to the Atlantic Ocean. The British will also end up having many of these conflicts back in Europe as well. But there is a period of time, about 10 years, sometimes called King George's War. The colonists, especially those who didn't really feel that it was necessary, would have called it the War of Jenkins' Ear. Why call something the War of Jenkins' Ear? Well, there was a man named Robert Jenkins who was a English merchant ship captain, and in 1731 his ship was captured by a Spanish vessel, and they took his cargo and much of his crew, and when he put up a fight, he ended up having his ear cut off. That ear he kept for many years. And he would bring it out when people were talking about British issues with the Spanish, or any time in which he wanted to demonstrate that there needed to be a more forceful response to those nations that were challenging Great Britain. And in 1739, Parliament will declare war on Spain. And part of the testimony that was given in order to justify going to war was the story that Robert Jenkins was able to retell, including producing the ear. But for 10 years, you have this period that the colonists would have called the War for Jenkins' Ear. Again, most of it never touched the colonies directly. It was in the Atlantic Ocean. But in this time period is where we're going to have the Stono Rebellion and the slave conspiracies in New York City in 1741 and 1742, both of which we believe were brought about because the Spanish were attempting to offer freedom to any person who was enslaved in the British colonies who could get to Spanish Florida. So certainly this was an event that colonists knew about. They may not have seen it as a direct threat, except for those particularly living in areas where there was a larger slave population. So now we need to take ourselves to the eve of the French and Indian War. And we can see that from our map here that the area that we're going to be speaking about where this war originally begins is going to be in the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, in an area that was known as the Ohio Valley. So this dark green area just south of the Ohio River. This was part of France's land claims. Our yellow on our screen is the Virginia colony, what Great Britain claims. And by the 1750s, a group of British investors and investors in Virginia had begun a scheme by which they were selling tracts of land in this green section. They called themselves the Ohio Company. They paid a team of surveyors to go out there and to measure the land, and were selling people land that technically the British Crown did not control. But in surveying this land, forming the company, and then trying to clear the French presence out of this area, we will bring about war. So the gentleman on my screen, you've probably seen lots of depictions of him much later in life, but this is a 21-year-old George Washington. And if you notice his uniform, there's a lot of red in it because he was part of the Virginia militia. So he worked side by side with British troops. And therefore, there's some similarity in the coloring. He was one of those surveyors and one of those early investors with the Ohio Company. His brother ran a very large plantation called Mount Vernon and was advised to go get a skill, which was surveying, mapping, and then turn that into getting his own land and becoming his own successful farmer. And that is how he gained expertise in that area, and actually was sent out to inform the French who were living in forts along the Ohio River that it was time for them to clear out, that the British were coming. And that ultimately will be our direct effect in creating this French and Indian War. You also probably have seen this image before. If you notice when I'm on screen, part of this hangs behind me to the side. This was a political cartoon drawn by Benjamin Franklin, published in his newspaper. And his great concern was that if there was going to be a war, that the colonists would not be well prepared and they would not be able to rely just on British help. Most of Great Britain's forces were not in the colonies. And as he pointed out, that probably the head of the snake, where there were the most people and certainly some of the most money, would be in New England. And this portion needed to definitely be united as they faced the French in Canada, but that all of these colonies, if they couldn't work together, they would die. And he was encouraging them to participate in something called the Albany Plan of Union. But our causes of the French and Indian War, again, to kind of backtrack a little bit, we have this area of the Ohio Valley. What you see here that's on my screen, that it's got kind of a blue and red lines through it. And this area is now being claimed by Great Britain. It's being sold to potential investors. In George Washington being sent by Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia to go and clear out the French. The French tell him to go away. They have no plans to clear out. And so George Washington returns, and the Virginia governor says, I'm going to give you troops, so more men for the militia, and also British troops, and you are to go out and you are to stake your claim and make a presence known. And in doing so, they are attacked by French soldiers in the area and actually have to create a makeshift fort that they call Fort Necessity because it was vital. It was needed for their own protection. After several weeks of fighting and a high loss of life and many people being wounded, George Washington and the troops that are left go back to Virginia to seek aid. And more British troops go out, and this time they do prevail outside of what we call Pittsburgh today at a place called Fort Duquesne, and they do successfully take it. And the next stage is, now that we are engaged in war, Great Britain has declared war against France and vice versa. Where is this war going to be fought? The British early on realize that they can't fight it in the Ohio Valley. Right? There's no airplanes, there's no mechanized vehicles to move men and material potentially 200 to 300 miles from Williamsburg, Virginia, which was the capital, was ridiculous. It was not something that was going to be functional, and that the French were pretty well entrenched and had control of the Ohio River waterway. And so the British decided that what they would use to their advantage was their very large navy, and that they would carry troops all the way north and also across the Atlantic, sail down the St. Lawrence River, and basically launch attacks on those river cities like Quebec. This proved to be a much more useful strategy. And within 2 years, the British were able to capture those strategic points, and the war now will transition across the globe. And there will be fighting in Europe, there will be fighting in the Philippines, off the coast of Africa, but the war in the colonies is all but over by the time we get to 1758, 1759. Our French and Indian War, again, to talk about the Indians, we have an alliance. The French have long worked with the Huron and Algonquin peoples who were enemies of the Iroquois. So we actually have a division now of large native groups, one on the side of the French and one on the side of the British. But ultimately, the sheer number of British forces that they can send, although it is of great expense to send these men across the ocean and then basically from Boston travel northward and then southward back down the St. Lawrence. They fought on some of the Great Lakes as well, but they will eventually capture Quebec in the city of Montreal. And for many historians, they look at that event as ultimately what sets United States in motion. The great cost of fighting the war to win those strategic points and gain control over French power in North America will incur taxes. And those taxes eventually will be what the colonists will attempt to rise up against and eventually create their own nation. But you can see similar map, but this time we're just looking at the various native peoples who would have been united in this conflict. So the Iroquois Confederacy, so the 5 tribes, they are going to be the allies of Great Britain. The Huron and the Algonquin, who were the native peoples north of the Great Lakes, they are going to side with the French. In losing, the Huron and the Algonquin are going to continue to fight against the British and the colonists. The Iroquois will find themselves in a particularly difficult position in that they are now united with the British, but the British at their colonists are going to want to continue pushing west and eventually push upon the land that the Iroquois control in New York State. So our long-term effects are going to be that we have a group of colonists who are happy that Great Britain controls so much land and has made some of the native conflict go away. But the British are going to be very hesitant and certainly not have the financial resources to allow the colonists to push west in the way that they hope to do so. So with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, the British get control of French territory that was all east of the Mississippi, including that in Canada. They're also, with this Treaty of Paris, also with Spain, they're going to get control of what is Florida as well. And so the empire has increased tremendously. But there are native conflicts. In particular, a group of native people who live amongst where Detroit lies today will rise up against the British. The British will basically try to take over the forts that the French had possessed in these areas. And Pontiac, who is the chieftain of the Huron people, will ask them to rise up and not allow the British to simply control the area. And in doing so, will eventually have his revolt put down. But the British realize that they cannot send enough men to offer protection for settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that is what begins the proclamation line. So our red line here on our map is indicative of that. That line was to prevent colonists from going west. It was a line on a map. There were plenty of colonists who did not obey, that continued to travel west. But be west of this line, the British did not guarantee your protection. And for some settlers, particularly backcountry people, they certainly saw this as big of a threat as the taxes that will come to be. And those taxes are a result of the debt. In order to pay for this war, just the war that was fought in the colonies, there are millions and millions and millions of dollars that have to be recouped. And they're going to do that by taxing the colonists because they've already taxed their own people to cover the cost of the war that's been fought in Europe and elsewhere. So we're going to end with today with just an idea that we can visualize now what belongs to France, what belongs to Spain. And as you can see, there's very little that actually belongs to France at the end of this conflict. Spain and Great Britain take over most of the land claims in North America as a result of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. As always, we've got some closeout questions. We definitely want to know a cause and an effect of the French and Indian War. We want to know what was the Albany Plan of Union, what was the Ohio Valley, and why were people attempting to gain control of it, and what lands did the British acquire with the Treaty of Paris of 1763.